Good morning. My name is Jonathan, and I'm the lead pastor. And if we haven't met, I would love to get to meet you at another time. So here is the question for today: Is it true? Is it real? Is it good? And for that matter, is it so good and so real and good that it's worth placing the full weight of my life, the whole weight of your life, your hopes, your decisions, and your preferences upon it? Here is what is irrefutable. So 2,000 years ago, there was 0 Christians. If you could somehow magically go back to the year 6 AD, if you could go back to 30 AD, you could look around all you want and you would find no Christians. Jesus had been born by that point. Some people maybe believe some things about him, but there was no Christians in 30 AD. And then all of a sudden, in 70 AD, so just 30, 40 years later, there was Christians all over the place, all over the Roman Empire, in all kinds of different cities, some that you've heard of, some that you haven't heard of, some that were teeny, small little groups meeting in houses, some that were multiple groups meeting in multiple houses, some that were meeting underground somewhere in Rome, where all of these Christians everywhere. And what history tells us about these early Christians in 70 AD and beyond is that they weren't just like Christians in name only. Like they weren't like culturally Christian. They weren't just like, they didn't just like inherit it from their parents and they like occasionally went to church every once in a while. Like these early Christians were like uber serious about this whole thing. I mean, their lives had been absolutely transformed. They had at some point made a decision that they were going to believe in Jesus, and that decision was changing everything. It changed who they worshiped. It changed the way in which they associated with the empire and with Caesar and who was really the king of their life. It changed the way in which they handled their money. It changed the way in which they treated other people. It was upsetting kind of the caste system of the day. If here's who's the higher up people, and here's the lower people, here's the people you're supposed to associate with, here's the people you're supposed to eat with, and here's the people you're not supposed to eat with. All of it was like completely upended by these people. And we know how much this transformed these early Christians, not just by looking through the Bible, although that's a wonderful source to be able to do that, but this is what history records for us. And so here's just a couple examples. This first one is by a guy named Pliny the Younger. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Pliny the Younger, way better than Pliny the Older. Pliny the Younger was a governor in Rome, and he was writing back and forth to the emperor because he was having the problem with these early Christians that he was trying to prosecute. And here's what Pliny the Younger wrote about these early Christians. He said, well, here's what they do, is on a stated day, they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak, and they would recite a hymn among themselves to Christ as though he were a god. They were singing to this guy who had been crucified, and they were singing as if he were a god. And that so far from binding themselves by oath to not commit any crime, so since we believe this guy is God, here's what we're going to commit to each other. We're not going to commit to do any crime. Their oath was we're going to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and to deny trust money placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver it. We're going to give our money away. And this was just kind of like, this is what these early Christians do. They get together and they make an oath. Here's this radical new way that we are going to live. Second one is from a guy named Tacitus. So Tacitus was a Roman historian who wrote around 115 AD. And here's what he said about early Christians. He said, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. This is just history. This is just what happened. This is kind of known in the Roman Empire. and a most mischievous superstition. Interesting, what they believed, that what these Christians believed wasn't just like something just purely historical, but there's something historical that was also like, there was like something superstitious about it. There was something, they believed something kind of like extraordinary, radical, miraculous had happened. And it was checked for a moment, but then it broke out again, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but now even in Rome. It was just kind of, there's these Christians, it's like everywhere, who believe this mischievous superstition. Another one is from Licinian, who is a 2nd century writer in the Roman Empire. And what he wrote is this. He said, the Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rite. So it all kind of came from Jesus and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver, Jesus, that they all are brothers. And from that moment, they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. So these Christians were doing. And then the last one, this one does come from the Bible, from a book of the Bible called Acts. And so in the book of Acts, these Christians are starting these churches all over the place. And Christians came to a city called Thessalonica. And when they came to Thessalonica, it was Paul and some other folks. People had heard about Christianity and how it was like showing up in all these other towns. And what was the reputation was that when Christianity came to a town, it just kind of like upset everything, because these new Christians started not following Caesar as God anymore, as king. They started not worshiping the local gods. It upset the social systems. It was like a radical change of like, here's how everyone else in the empire lives. But when these people start following Jesus, they start living a completely different way. And some people were a little nervous about that. And so when Paul and these other folks started telling these people in Thessalonica about Jesus, here's what happened. So they dragged Jason and some of the brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, "These who have turned the world upside down have come here too." That's what happened in the first century. That's what's undeniable, is that there was a group of people who, because of their belief in Jesus, started absolutely turning their lives and turning the world upside down. And so an interesting question is what was it that made them turn the world upside down? What made them start to live such radically different lives? What was it that they heard? Because kind of the perception we get is that there's all these kind of cities all over the empire, and they're just kind of operating in their like normal world. You know, the city of Rome's kind of doing its deal, and Thessalonica's doing its deal, and the city of Corinth is doing its thing. All these cities are just kind of like operating. What's up, Wes? As you do. All these cities are just kind of operating, like all the people are going to work and doing their home stuff. And then one day, somebody or somebodies would walk into this town, or sometimes they were from there, they would walk back into this town. People like Paul, Peter, Priscilla, Epaphras, they would walk into these cities. And it's like, what was it that they started telling other people that when they told them so radically changed their beliefs? And here's what we're told. Here's what they said, is that they preached the gospel over and over and over again. This is what these people were doing, is showing up in these towns, and they're preaching the gospel, which then raises the question, what is the gospel? What exactly did they say? What was it that they were presenting? When Paul stood up in Athens, when the people left Jerusalem and they went back and they started this early church in Rome, when Paul and Priscilla started a church in Corinth, like what was it? What was this gospel that they presented that so transformed everything? And here's what they presented, is they presented the story of Jesus. As we've talked about this around here, that we believe this is what the gospel is the gospel is the story of Jesus. Any of the stories of Jesus, that is the gospel. Here's one way that Peter and a guy named Barnabas shared this. Peter and Silas. It says, "As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. These early Christians believed that they had seen something, they had heard something, and they were now sharing those stories. So to illustrate this a little bit, I need a little bit of crowd response for a second. And so when you think about the idea of them sharing the story of Jesus, what is one of your favorite stories of Jesus? And I'll ask a couple of you guys to shout it out. So you can share a thing that Jesus did, you can share a thing that Jesus claimed, or you can share something that Jesus taught, or any other combination of that. What's some of your favorite things that people might have seen and heard of Jesus? Shout a few of them out. On the road to Emmaus. There's a time where Jesus was on the road to Emmaus with some people that didn't recognize him. All of a sudden, like, oh, you're that guy who just died and you're resurrected. Yeah, that's a good story. And so, surely, as they were going around to all these cities, that was one of the stories they would share. It was like, oh yeah, there was this time, there was these two guys walking on the street, and they would tell the story of the road to Emmaus, and when they were doing that, they were sharing the gospel. What's another one, Jimmy? Gathering his disciples. Yeah, great story. Like, oh, there's this time like Jesus went out, and instead of picking like the best and the brightest, he just went to a lake and he like saw these people and they're like, drop your, and they hadn't caught anything all night, and like drop your nets, and they had all this fish, and instead of starting a big fishing business, they dropped their nets and they followed Jesus. Great story. And of course, when they're going around to all these different cities, they're telling the story of how Jesus gathers disciples from just kind of in this miraculous thing. Of course. What's another thing that Jesus might have said? Yeah, you are going to always speak, aren't you, Joel? I love that. There you go. Joel came to me last week. He's like, just so you know, if you ever open it up for anybody to say anything, I'm going to say something. I like that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a time where Jesus went to Samaria, which, a Jewish person didn't normally even walk through Samaria, and then he's having a conversation with a woman. A lot of people wouldn't have a conversation with a woman. Turns out she was a sinful woman, whatever that meant. Yeah, Jesus has this like incredible, honoring, noble conversation, and like, man, of course, especially in all these cities where they thought that like God only loved certain groups of people. Like, man, I bet that would have been a story they would have shared a lot of, like how much God did. Give me a couple more. Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Yeah, this time where Jesus, who's the king of the world, gets down and he serves and he says, this is how I want you to serve other people as I have served you. Yeah, it would have been a great story. Yeah, Bruce? Yeah. Right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, time Jesus helps someone. Yeah, absolutely. Would have been a huge story. And they would have had better context because, like, when we read that now, we're like, geez, that's kind of mean. But they would have had better context. That's a little bit nicer. Yeah, yeah, great. All amazing. And so as they're going around, this is what they're sharing. Is they're sharing all of these different stories. And they're just kind of like percolating all throughout the empire. And then something started happening. So Jesus died, rose from the dead, somewhere around 33 to 36 AD. The early church blew up kind of all over the Roman Empire. All these people are sharing pieces of the gospel. Then somewhere around 40 AD, people started writing some of this stuff down. And so they started writing, mostly these are in our Bible, in the collection of letters and ancient documents that we call the Bible, or all these we call New Testament letters and other different things, where they started to write down, here's some of the things that Jesus said, here's some of the things that Jesus did, and a lot about because Jesus said this, because Jesus claimed this, here's how we should apply this in our life. And kind of giving like commentary about how all of this looks. And so now we come to like 60 to 70 AD. Christian movement has blown up all over the Roman Empire. There's all these new Christians meeting in houses and catacombs and all this stuff, and they've all heard these different stories about Jesus. Surely some of them heard the same stories about Jesus, but there's so many stories about Jesus. Surely they heard different stories, and now there's these letters that are starting to go around, and even some narratives about what Jesus. But somewhere between 60 to 70 AD, this guy named Luke sat down, and Luke decides he is going to write. And here's what Luke writes. He says, many. How many? We don't know. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. He's just kind of speaking what we just looked at. That for the last 30 years, many people have been talking about this. Many people have been giving oral reports. Some people have even taken the time to write this down and start to share it around a little bit. And many people have been writing this down. And what Luke wants you to know is that what they have been sharing and what they have been writing about is that something happened. That what has gone on is a new event. And so what Luke doesn't say is he doesn't say, many people have tried to write about this new religion that is formed. He doesn't say, many people have tried to draw up an account of this new philosophy for how you're supposed to live. It's not about this new social way that you're supposed to treat your neighbors. It wasn't about, here's this new kind of way in which you can worship the gods. What he is drawing an account to is that something happened, that something right in our midst has occurred, and people have been talking about it, people have been writing about it, and now I'm going to draw up an account of these things that have happened in our midst. I like how a guy named Scott McKnight talks about this in a resource we're going to talk about. And we're going to look at this book that Luke wrote 2,000 years ago, 60 to 70 AD. And here's what Luke is writing. That's what Scott says. It says, the Gospel of Luke is a biography. And so when you read through the book of Luke, what you're reading is a biography. It is a story. It is a historical telling of this guy named Jesus and what Jesus did. Now, for the twister, though, it's not just a biography, turns out. For the twister that tells the truth, this biography is the gospel. So this story is the gospel, is the good news, is what all these people have been preaching that gives life and salvation. The book itself is not just a biography. There's other biographies that have been written. We're going to talk about those. But this biography of Jesus is the gospel itself. Biography is gospel, and the gospel is a biography. And it's like a ground set. That's like an important thing for us to all kind of get on the level with. When we talk about the gospel, and when it says that they preached the gospel, this is what they preached, is they preached the story of Jesus. And now Luke, after all of these years, 30, 40 years of it going all over the place, he is now going to try to put together an account of this biography, this life of Jesus. How did Luke find out about the story of Jesus? Well, here's what he says. It says, this account, just as they were handed down to us by those from who first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And this is incredibly important. As we read through the book of Luke, and we're going to look at Luke a lot over the next little bit. As you read through the book of Luke, what we are reading is not something that was handed down over centuries and centuries. It's not something that was just hearsay. But what Luke is reporting is that these are things that eyewitnesses saw. That there were people who actually saw and heard these things, and now they are being reported. And I think this is especially important. If you're kind of coming into this, as we're going to go into the book of Luke, and you consider yourself to be a little bit of a skeptic, and that's great. We're glad you're here. If you have some questions, if you have some doubts about this whole thing, that's great. We encourage you to bring all that skepticism, all those questions, and all those doubts. But what you should know as you're bringing those questions is that Luke is at least stating, and you can argue with him, maybe he's lying, maybe this is all some sort of fiction, but he is not presenting this as any kind of a myth. He is presenting this as something that eyewitnesses actually saw and heard. And so if you come to the conclusion that this is all somehow made up or it was all fabricated or a lie, then you have to say, what was Luke doing then? Did he know he was did he make up these eyewitnesses? Did the eyewitnesses make it up? Something else must have happened because Luke records this in such a way that this is something that actually happened. And you see this as we go through the book of Luke, is that Luke doesn't write this in a way of saying once upon a time in a land far away, there was these things that happened. Luke writes this as very historical, real-time, real place. I'll give you one example of it. This comes from Luke 3, so we'll look at all of it. again, not writing this, somewhere, you can kind of guess, the facts are a little bit murky, but here's kind of what happened. Instead, here's how Luke is writing this. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod the tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip the tetrarch of Iturea, sure, and Judaeus, and Licinius and tetrarch of Abilene, real people, real places, people that's like, this is like a thing in history. During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness, and he went to all the country around the Jordan. He's writing this as something that was like a factual thing in history. You could go and you could see these real places, these real people, parallel it with also real history. Luke goes on. He says, with this in mind, so there's all these eyewitnesses, all these different stories out here. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. And so since all these different eyewitnesses have been had, what I did is I wanted to go around and I wanted to have kind of an orderly account. So all these different stories, and you heard this story and I heard this story. I wanted a kind of a grouped account of what all of these things. And so I went around and I have carefully investigated this. What does carefully investigated mean? We don't know precisely, but it means that he carefully investigated. Maybe he went to some of these individual eyewitnesses. That's what I like to think, is that he went around to a lot of these individuals and say, okay, I've heard the story about Jesus being born. Mary, tell me the story of what actually happened. And I like to think that when we're reading the book of Luke, we're hearing kind of an interview that Luke did with Mary. I don't know if that's exactly what happened, but he does say that somehow the eyewitness account of Mary, of Joseph, of these disciples, of the Samaritan woman, of this woman who did a meal with Jesus, all of these and people who had their feet washed by Jesus, that these eyewitnesses did pass on these stories, and Luke has carefully investigated to say which are the ones that are true, which are the ones should be passed on. And he's doing this for a guy named Theophilus. Theophilus, we don't know much about, and we don't even actually know if he was like a real person. So kind of two big schools on Theophilus. One is that Theophilus was a real person. He was a wealthy Roman person, and he was paying Luke. He says, all these different accounts are happening. I need to know what actually happened. Let me tell you what, Luke. Let me give you like a stipend, and I'm going to kind of pay for you to go and research all of this for the next little bit, and then that way you can, and so Theophilus is kind of doing this, so Luke is kind of doing this in honor of Theophilus so he can have this information. Maybe. Another idea is that Theophilus, this actual word, just means friend of God. And so maybe this is just a literary device saying, this is just for anyone who's a friend of God, this is kind of for you and for your behalf. I don't know which theory is right. I don't necessarily even lean one way or the other. So pick your own theory of who Theophilus is. Luke, we know, was someone who probably was not an eyewitness of many of these things, but we think he was a friend of many of these eyewitnesses. That's why I like the idea of him like interviewing a lot of these people, because Luke wrote two books and they're collected in the Bible, Luke and the book of Acts, also written by Luke. And in the book of Acts, at some point like midway through the story, it shifts pronouns from like Paul did this and Barnabas did this. It shifts it to all these we's. And so we went and did this, and we went and did this. And so the idea is that Luke was a traveling partner of Paul and was friends with Peter, friends with Barnabas, friends with Priscilla, friends with Aquila. He had met a lot of these people, and through those had been able to interview and ask questions. And now Luke is someone who's trying to record all of this for us. Now, a great question as we look into all of this is, why? Why was it that Luke took the time to carefully investigate, to track down all of these eyewitnesses, to tell the story, the biography of Jesus? In a day and age 2,000 years ago, before Amazon, before Barnes and Nobles, literature was way less common. People were not writing story after story after story. And even now, I mean, you could go to Barnes & Noble's. Does that even exist anymore? Okay. Sorry. If Meg goes to Barnes & Noble's and you go to the biography section, there will certainly be many different biographies out there of lots of important people, way more than there would have been 2,000 years ago. But for most of us living in this room, there will never be a point in time where someone can go to Barnes & Noble's and read a biography that was written about us. And most people that we meet, most people that we spend time with, just common people, don't have people write books about them. And from what we can gather about Jesus' life is he was this kind of common Jewish day laborer who turned into a rabbi, was crucified. This was not like a blockbuster affair. And so why was it that in a day and age when biographies were not a common thing to be able to write down, why was this one written down? And why was it so popular? And why has it remained so popular? So in comparison, another biography written around that time was a guy named Plutarch, and he wrote a series of biographies called The Lives. How many people have read Plutarch? Anybody Plutarch? Wow, it's like three very smart people in the room have read some Plutarch. It's very cool. If you want to, you can actually go to Amazon today. For $41, you can buy Plutarch's Lives, and it's written down. It's about 1,000 pages, and it goes over about 48 different biographies of some very important Roman people. And it makes sense. Like when you look at it, I mean, it's Aristotle, it's the Caesars, it's Plato, it's people, it's like, these are very important people that it was worth writing them down for. But here's what's true about Plutarch's life, is that kind of the way that things were written down, like they were written on parchment paper, so it faded pretty quick. And so you had to write something down on parchment, knowing this isn't going to last long. And so you would make a copy of it, then a copy of it, and a copy of it. And pretty soon, like all these different copies were going around. And so of any ancient document, we don't have an original of almost any of them. We go back to what are the copies. And so when you look at Plutarch, very important, written down, it has about 12 to 15 different kind of oldest manuscripts that were written down because they wanted to preserve it and it was copied that much. And many of you, besides our 3 or 4 very smart people, had probably not even heard of Plutarch before, hadn't read the lives. It has made very little impact on your life. Well, on the other hand, when you look at the book of Luke, written around the same time, about this person who at the time seemed far less significant, had been copied and copied and copied so many more times, thousands of early manuscripts of the book of Luke, and has made such a difference in so many people's lives. And why? Why was it that this was written down initially, and why was it that it has made such a big difference to so many people over the last 2,000 years? And here's what Luke says. He says, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Why? So that you may know the certainty of the things that you had been taught. So whoever Theophilus was, whether he was just a general friend of God or whether he was a specific person, he had been taught some things about Jesus. He had been taught that Jesus washes people's feet. He had been taught that Jesus loves even Samaritans. They had been taught that Jesus has power over death. They had been taught that Jesus forgives sins. All these things that seemed so amazing, possibly even too good to be true. And now he wanted to take the time to write these things down so that we could know, we could actually be certain about these things. And that word certainty, I have like a very interesting relationship with. So actually, I read a book a while ago called The Death of Certainty, talking about how like certainty in kind of like a black and white world really isn't all that necessary, and like we need more nuance in our world today. And like if you know me very well, like I love that kind of thinking of like, oh this, but oh maybe also this. And that. I love the idea of like ideas and not necessarily have everything be so black and white and clear. But for what Luke is going for here, the idea of certainty, the idea of like, is this something that I can like really believe in or not? Is this something that is true? Is this something that is real? Is this something that is good? Is this something that I can actually put the weight of my life on. And my goal is that I want to have enough certainty about Jesus and the things that he taught that I can truly put the weight of my life upon it. And my goal for all of you and for our whole church and for anyone who we meet out in the city is that they would at some point research Jesus enough, investigate him enough, carefully research the things that he said, things that he did, where they can have certainty that they can actually put their life in the hands of Jesus and follow Jesus as their complete God, complete Savior, complete everything. So over the next couple months, we are going to look entirely through this biography of what Luke wrote about Jesus. All of these things that Jesus said that Luke is claiming he investigated, eyewitnesses, these are the things that Jesus did. These are the gospel. We're going to look at this for, I don't know, it's going to be a while. So here's my plan for the next little bit. Normally what we do is we start a new series, and I have sketched out a kind of a long file and calendar to say, okay, on this week we're going to do this and this week. And sometimes, they're 4 or 5 weeks. Sometimes they've been as much as like 8 or 16 weeks. But I always have kind of here's exactly what we're going to cover and when we're going to cover it. I have not done that with Luke because this is going to be a while. And so today we're starting Luke 1 through 5. There's 25 chapters in Luke. There's a lot of verses, and we're going to go at kind of the pace that seems right to go in. And so this will very well take all of this next year. It might even go beyond then. But it's kind of when we get to a point like, hey, we think this is good enough to talk about for this Sunday, that's what we're going to talk about, and we'll keep going. And we're just going to literally go verse by verse through the entire book. And the reason why I think it's worthwhile for us to spend an entire year or maybe more painfully going through every little thing that Jesus said and everything that Jesus did and all these things that Jesus claimed is that I believe that every single one of those are a piece of the gospel, and they in their entirety make up the gospel. And we need to know if we're going to follow Jesus and if we're going to have certainty in all the things that he taught, then we need to know and have read and have researched and looked at all of the things that Jesus said and did and claimed. A couple different resources as we go through this over this next year. First, so you're not like surprised over the next couple weeks, I'm introing the whole thing today. If you come back next week, you're like, all right, let's do some more Luke. We're not going to talk about Luke next week, just so you know. We're finishing up a series that we've been going through. I know, it's crazy. We've been going through a series going through who we are as a church, and so we actually have 2 more weeks in that series. And so this next week, we've been talking about who we want to be in the city of Albany, and especially our posture towards people in the city of Albany. And next week, we're going to talk about our last posture. I think it's the most important posture of how we want to live in relation to the people in Albany. So make sure you come next week. And there's going to be a brunch next week, by the way, and so make sure you bring food, or else it won't be a brunch. It'll just be sitting around tables. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to have our kids are going to be singing a song for us. I think some of our teenagers are going to be in the band. And we've been talking about who we are as a church. Church is a group of people. And so we're going to talk about one of our most big ideas, that church as a group of people, we are diverse. We want to be together. We want to be in these special relationships like we talked about, intentional discipleship relationships. But coming up in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about that we want to be a multi-generational church. And so we're going to focus on our huge value of kids and teens. And so that's going to be the next 2 weeks. Then on December 26th, we're going to get back into Luke, and we're just going to keep going. And so first resource I want to point you to is our Sunday morning service. Over the next year, I would encourage you to be at as many Sunday services as you can be. We're going to have discussions about what Luke looks like. We're going to teach about all these different things that Jesus did from Luke. And if you can't be here on Sunday morning, it's available on YouTube, on the podcast, and I think that's a really great resource. But then on top of that, we want to encourage you to study it on your own and with a group. And so I definitely encourage you to read through the book of Luke, hopefully many times over the next little bit. If you listen to it, I listened to it a couple weeks ago while I was running. It's about an hour and 15 minutes if you listen to the whole thing straight. So it's not like a giant commitment. You can read through, listen to the whole book of Luke. If you sit down and read, you can do it that way. A couple other resources I want to point your attention to. One is this is just called Luke. It's called the New Testament Everyday Bible Study. These are in your program, by the way, so you don't have to try to write these down. This goes through all 25 of the chapters and divides each of the chapters into little segments and gives you about a page to 3 pages of like basic commentary. Sometimes the Bible can be weird. And it says, they went to this festival. What is that festival? They were doing this activity. What is that activity? They were in this region. What is that region? So it just helps us get a little bit more of context of what was happening in these stories. And then it gives 5 to 6 questions that you can discuss with your family. You can discuss it with your community group. It could be a really great resource. And so I would encourage you to check that out. It could be a great thing for you to do over the next year. The next one, there's one called Following King Jesus. This has 24 different sessions in it. So this is designed to do with a group. Again, like we talked about a few weeks ago, a group can be 2 people. A group can be as many as like 8 to 10 people. But you get together 24 times, and it'll talk about what does it look like for us to, this guy who came down, Jesus, claimed to be king, did all these things as king. What does it look like for us to follow him? So that could be a really helpful resource. And then the last one, and potentially the easiest, but I think a really great one, is just to do what we call Discovery Bible Study. And so each week when we get together on Sunday morning, I will throw up a couple different verses from Luke, and then you can use these questions that are available out there on the table to go through and have a discussion with a couple people about those verses and just to kind of dive into them, and that could be a really great resource. But I would love for all of us over the next year to not just on Sunday mornings, but to beyond, to really take time to, this thing that Luke wrote down has been preserved for us for 2,000 years. It has been copied and copied and copied and distributed all over the world in all these different languages. And it all started with Luke, eyewitness, investigating some of these people so that we could have certainty in this. And so whether you're already a believer in Jesus, whether you're thinking about becoming a believer in Jesus, it seems like it would be worth all of our time to take a deep dive into the gospel of Jesus. And again, I think it's helpful for everybody, but there's at least 2 wide groups that I think that this series could be especially helpful for. The first is that if you're here and you do not consider yourself a Christian yet, if you are just interested in the idea of Jesus, I'm not sure why you're here today. I'm so glad that you are, though. But if you're just interested in the idea of Jesus, if you're like, hey, John, I don't know if I believe in this Jesus thing. I have questions. I have doubts. The whole deal. What should I do? The thing I would tell you to do before anything else is I would say, just start looking into Jesus. Just start spending time discovering what Jesus said and what Jesus did. The primary thing throughout the book of Luke that Jesus asked people, he never asked people 0 times. He never asked people to become a Christian. That wasn't a phrase. The phrase he would ask people is, hey, come follow me. Just come, just watch. Just come listen for a little while. Just come see what I do. Just come see the kind of people I hang out with. Just kind of watch and learn. And the more you watch and learn, the more you might decide that you want to not just follow me, but you want to actually become my disciple. And so if you're just interested, I would encourage you just to follow. The second group is if you're someone who maybe you consider yourself a Christian, but it's a part of you where it's like, I don't know, you wonder maybe if there's something that's like missing. Because you see other people and the way in which they follow Jesus, and it's like, I think I'm a Christian. I come to church every once in a while, but like, I don't know if there's this part of radically following Jesus that it seems like some other people kind of get, and I don't know if I've totally caught on to that. Or maybe you like still consider yourself a Christian, but there's like part of like the Christianity that you were taught, whether it was, in a church growing up, or whether it was, in a podcast, or whether it was a book, or maybe it was with your parents. And there's a part of it that as you're like now navigating adult life and adult issues and adult crises maybe, there's a part of it that you're even starting to doubt and question. And you're wondering like, is part of the faith that I was handed as a kid, can I hang on to that? And will it hold up to like the rigors and stresses of like adult life? I think this series could be very, very helpful for you to kind of step back and say, I'm just going to put on hold for a second some of the things that I was taught. And now I just want to spend a year looking, what was Jesus actually? So just think about that. I want to read this. This is from the beginning of the King Jesus book that we recommended as a small group material. But I love what she says here, and I resonate with this. It's a part of my story, and I thought maybe some of you might resonate too. But here's what she writes. She writes, what is the difference between a Christian and a follower of Jesus? There shouldn't be one, but in practice, often there is. We Christians don't always follow the one whose name we bear. I know because I've called myself a Christian for 33 years, but for long stretches of that time, the religion I practiced had little to do with Jesus. I inherited Christianity along with brown eyes and big feet. And even though I knew all about Jesus, he got awfully buried under Christianity and the rules that went along with it. The Christianity I grew up with tried to keep me safe. Believe precisely this way, and your doctrine will be safe. Follow these principles about relationships, and your heart will be safe. Do these practices, and your spiritual life will be safe. Keep all of these God-ordained rules, and you will have a happy, blessed life and be safe in heaven when you die. There was only one problem. The rules didn't work. One by one, I found out the promises were false. The rules didn't keep me safe from a broken heart. They didn't keep me safe from abuse. They didn't keep me safe from Christian leaders who misused their power. My Christianity crumbled in my 20s when I realized I wasn't safe and I wasn't happy, and some of the well-known Christian teachers who had made promises in the rules turned out to be hypocrites, and I could no longer trust. I couldn't handle the feeling of my spiritual guts tumbling out, so I held myself together with rubber bands of willpower and denial. It worked for a few years while I graduated college, got a job, got married, had a couple kids, and half-heartedly volunteered at my church. Not half-hearted because I lacked enthusiasm, but half-hearted because I was so locked up to keep myself from feeling anything that I only had half a heart to give. Postpartum depression and repressed grief and trauma finally stretched all those rubber bands till they snapped and I fell apart. An emotional breakdown left me crying every day, barely functioning, and fighting for my life against suicidal thoughts. That raw, empty place is where God met me in the wild comfort of the Holy Spirit and set me on a healing journey that transformed not only my mind and heart, but also my spirit. As I healed through therapy and antidepressants, I began deconstructing and then reconstructing my Christianity. Through that whole painful process, I learned what Christianity was really about. It's not about a set of inward beliefs and outward cultural practices. It's not about safety, and it's not about rules. It's about being transformed inside and out into knowing, thinking, and feeling, and acting, and loving like Jesus. In other words, being a Christian is about actually following Jesus. It's about the real story of Jesus, and we are going to go through every single piece of it, and I can't wait, and I hope that it transforms every single one of us. I want to say a quick prayer, and then we're going to go into a time of communion. Jesus, as we get ready to launch this adventure, I want to have certainty. I want my certainty to grow. That as we get ready to celebrate Christmas, that it's not just a time of fun traditions and festivities and songs, but that there's a true story that the God of the universe came down to earth to be with us as Emmanuel. The parents who couldn't have kids were able to have kids. The virgins gave births. That announcements were made to shepherds of all people. That you started a ministry, starting with the weak and the poor, that is still transforming the world today. God, help us to hear your story. The events that happened 2,000 years ago, according to eyewitnesses that Luke investigated. And help us as we go through them for our faith to grow and for us to put our total faith in you. In His name we pray. Amen. Today is the first Sunday